In today's interview for the National Centre for Military Intelligence, I'm going to be interviewing Tim Fryer, who's a trustee of the Medmenham Collection, and we're going to be talking about RAF Medmenham in the Second World War and air intelligence. Tim, thank you for joining me today. Can you give me a little bit of background about yourself before we start on the content proper?
Yes, surely. I became a RAF photographic interpreter in the 70s. And then the photographic interpretation branch became the RAF's intelligence branch. The intelligence branch they had in the wartime, in the Second World War, that sort of dissolved and became the photographic interpretation branch. Then they reinvented it, and as well as doing photographic interpretation jobs, I did some pure intelligence jobs and then some staff jobs. And then I decided to become a civilian imagery analyst, as they called them then, rather than photographic interpreters. And some of the people I knew at that time, I made a commitment to them that once I retired, I would get involved with the Medmenham Collection. So here I am within the Medmenham Collection. As you say, I'm a trustee. I'm one of the researchers, and you probably could call me an archivist as well.
Yes.
And I do regular visits to our archive and do some recording. And one of my privileges is to show people around the small museum we have within the Military Intelligence Museum here at Chicksands, where we're doing this interview.
Can you tell me what was RAF Medmenham?
Yes, the collection is named after Medmenham,
Yeah.
which was the site from April 1941 of the UK, and then importantly the whole Allied photographic interpretation effort. The formation of the photographic interpretation unit was at Wembley, where the RAF had taken over an organisation called the Aircraft Operating Company, who were mainly involved with aerial survey. They, after a few hiccups, became the embryonic photographic interpretation unit, using some of their staff, using equipment like the Vilt that you're sitting next to.
Or behind me here,
that's right,
yes.
Which was used by the surveyors. And that was very useful for the photographic interpretation role that was developing from the beginning of the war through 1940. And those pieces of equipment and the people that had become photographic interpreters at Wembley moved to Medmenham. They were outgrowing Wembley. Also, it received a few almost direct hits from bombs there. So they needed to find somewhere else. And like so many establishments during the wartime, particularly intelligence sites, they picked a nice country house, which is Danesfield House on the banks of the River Thames.
That's near Marlow, isn't it?
Yeah, between Marlow and Henley.
Yes.
One of the scrapbooks that we've got has got nice pictures of where it is on the banks of the Thames, and the person who was kept this scrapbook even marked up the room that they were using.
So it's quite a big site, isn't it?
A big site. As with all these sort of sites, there was a lot of building that went on, expansion, and lots of nissen huts and other facilities, and it grew up to be approaching 2,000 people working there by its peak in 1944. But a fabulous setting for people to be working in, and that probably contributed to the sense of doing something important and living in such a beautiful place.
But it was
they had a lot of fun as well. Yeah.
But it was top secret, wasn't it? So nobody would really know outside in the villages around. Would they in Buckinghamshire there?
They had suspicions, and I could tell you a nice little story. They were able to go to the local pubs, and in one of the pubs somebody was talking to one of the people who worked there and said, "I think you do something to do with photography." And they spotted that some of the photographers had some stains on their hands, and this chap had experience with photography. And he also said, "And I've spotted some yellow vans going in and out. That's Kodak colours, isn't it?" So they were aware of something going on, but generally, yes, very secure. And they weren't supposed to talk about anything. And in fact, some of the posters that would do the walls have ears and so on, some of them are actually drawn by some of the talented people who worked at Medmenham.
And do we know, are they all RAF personnel?
Right. Yes, one of the important things about, although Danesfield House was the main thing. They called it RAF Medmenham because it was administered by the Air Force. The bulk of people there were Air Force, but right from the start, and even in the days at Wembley, it was very much joint service. Okay, predominantly RAF, and a lot of the photographic work and all of the ancillary works and all the comsens and typing and so on was by predominantly RAF types. But definitely a joint service atmosphere there right from the start, and that joint serviceness still carries on today with any of the imagery intelligence type world, imagery analysis type world, and the very much joint service.
Do we know what percentage roughly would be women? Because they made a quite contribution, didn't they, to the site?
At its peak in 1944, the figures show that actually there were more women in uniform at the site than there were men. On the photographic interpreter side, women were employed in the early days at Wembley. The figures on trained photographic interpreters is just over 1,000 trained by the RAF. About a third were women there, so not predominantly women on the interpretation side. A lot of the interpreters, after they were trained, went through Medmenham. Quite a lot of them went overseas.
Yes.
Interestingly, some of the first ones to go overseas were a bunch of women who went out to North Africa. And I think they were the first uniform women to go out to North Africa.
So do we know how long the training was?
Sometimes it had to be sped up.
Yeah.
But generally I think it was about probably no more than about 6 weeks. And a lot of it was training on the job then. They would go into a section and see if they had the sort of skills and the aptitude for that particular section. And some would go from section to section until they found their little niche. And then, once they proved their worth on a particular subject area, they would stay for the duration. They would stay for the rest of the war.
So what we've got today then is this incredible collection, and am I right in thinking that it's spread across a few different sites? You've got bits and pieces housed
Yes.
elsewhere.
Here at Chicksands, where we've got this museum bit, that's just the tip of an iceberg of our archive. We're now up to 26,000 records.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's records of all sorts of things. A lot of documents, quite a lot of duplication within those documents, because as people cleared their attics and so on, we get lots of sets of notes, and it's a bit time consuming to go and see whether we've got one before. So within that 26,000 items, there's a bit of duplication. There's also, as well as documents, we've got a lot of artifacts, a lot of pieces of equipment, quite a lot of cameras, quite a lot of material, documents and equipment related to survey as well, which is very much an allied trade to the photographic interpretation.
And I know you've got quite a lot of stereoscopes as well, of different
We've
sizes.
Got all sorts of stereoscopes. Yes, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
And certainly when we have visitors, they enjoy looking at the stereo. Stereo, the Vilt machine I mentioned before, that is based on being able to look in stereo.
Yeah.
The photographic interpreters working at Medmenham, and since stereo is very important to them, and any of the aerial reconnaissance was predicated on taking stereo whenever possible. So the single camera with an overlapping timing such that there's an overlap in the frames gives you stereo, and all the cover that was taken with photographic aircraft was, I say, predicated on being stereo. And you see posed pictures of people at Medmenham and other sites during the war looking in stereo. That is posed, but that does show that they would be using stereo all the time. It's not just for the effects of that posed picture. Stereo is vitally important.
So I have myself, for some of my research, seen the aerial photography. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? But for people who may not know about this, what kind of things can you see, and what would they be looking for in the wartime? Can you give me an idea of the intelligence value really of this stuff?
Yes. probably best to talk about the one of the skills of photographing interpreters is a curiosity for the unusual. One of the veterans from Medmenham came up with that term, which I often use to explain the skill. The curiosity for the unusual means that you've got to spot the usual. You've got to be able to look at the photograph and say, right, I know what that is, I know what that is. So a general knowledge is very important, because you're just looking and saying, right, I can explain that. Then you come across the unexplained.
Yes.
And once you get the unexplained, then you've got to do a bit more research. You've got to find out more background of that place and what was happening. Crucially, you would want to be able to get previous cover, if possible, other collateral information, maps. During the Second World War, they had a cry out to, through the media, send us all your postcards of France and other places, send us your holiday snaps. Those were mostly end up at Medmenham and were used to get that extra bit of information. So you could then burrow down into that unexplained item to find out what was happening. But they did a lot of the work there in what they called second phase, which was to look through all the imagery and just spot if something else was happening. You'd report on airfields and ports and things like that.
Looking for changes.
But you would also be just looking overall and seeing, oh, right, something new there that needs reporting.
And particularly with, I suppose, one of the big ones, the Hitler's V weapons in the Second World War. That's a big impact, isn't it, that really made a difference in Medmenham's, legacy.
There's a whole story about the V weapons, which, running out of time here, I would recommend that people look out for the BBC's Operation Crossbow programme, where that was explained a lot, and featured the two grand gentlemen who set up most of the Medmenham Collection as a separate entity and set up this museum here. And that takes you through the photographic interpretation involvement with the V weapons side.
So have the collection featured, I know there are books about it, but hasn't it also featured in various documentaries?
As well as Operation Crossbow, we recently contributed a little bit to the item within a programme called Spitfire Factory, where they were talking about the photographic reconnaissance side. On the RAF's 100th anniversary, we ran a little feature within that, and Ewan McGregor getting really excited at looking at stereo. I was there watching them filming that bit, and Ewan McGregor was generally excited. That was the first time he'd seen stereo, and that was really exciting. On the book side, there's a great book called Spies in the Sky, which is written by Taylor Downing. He used us extensively.
Yes, it's classic.
And that's probably an opportunity to sort of go back to what we hold. A lot of what Taylor Downing found useful with us is material that's within people's memoirs, some of them unpublished, some personal photograph albums, etc. And also we have got some copies of items that are available in the National Archives or the Imperial War Museum or the RAF Museum, but we've got copies that are much more accessible within our archive to researchers like Taylor Downing.
Yes, because I've used a couple of those copies at the National Archives. So can anyone use the collection for research?
Both the museum element that's here at Chicksands and the archive are on active military bases, now run by Strategic Command. So you've got issues with being able to book people in. But post-COVID times, then it is possible to come and visit the museum. And of course, we will take people to the archive if they're sort of bona fide researchers.
Yes.
But we also react as best we can to inquiries that come in. We haven't got a huge profile out there, but people who are seriously researching anything to do with photographic intelligence, that's both the interpretation and indeed the reconnaissance side, when they eventually find us, and we are out there on the internet, then if a query comes in, then we will often be able to help. but it's all run by volunteers, and we have limited resources, so people shouldn't get their expectations up too greatly on how much we can research. One of the book publications that's coming out in 2021 is a new biography of Sarah Churchill.
Yes.
She was one of the notable photographic interpreter, Women's Auxiliary Air Force people at Medmenham, and we had some unique stuff that added hopefully add a lot of colour and extra excitement to the book.
And one of the other women, of course, that people will probably recognise from your site is Babington Smith.
Yes, yeah.
Do you have something on her to show me today?
Yes, Constance Babington Smith, who, as you know, wrote Evidence in Camera in 1957 as and it was authorised early on in her writing time, authorised by the Air Ministry as a story of Medmenham. One of our crown jewels is all the notes that she took to produce her book, and she was a very organised lady, and her notes are brilliant. And she also interviewed a lot of the people involved. 1957, so obviously still alive, and those give a great insight into the works there.
What are the actual origins of the collection?
The collection started a few years after the Second World War from the Medmenham Club. As with so many other wartime activities, a lot of the people who worked there suddenly realised in 1945, as they were being demobbed, we want to have reunions, we want to keep in touch. So the Medmenham Club was formed. A couple of decisions were made fairly on in the life of the club, which were important, is that they opened it up to people who weren't wartime veterans, because certainly going into national service, there were a lot of other people who were joining to do photographic interpretation. And they also made the decision to open it up to all ranks. Initially, it was very much an officers-only sort of reunion club, mainly because all the photographic interpreters, and that was the membership of the club, were commissioned officers. That was one of the policies they introduced. But they opened it up to all ranks, so that the club continued, and that helped Constance Babington Smith on writing a book to keep in touch with a lot of other veterans, and it continues to this day, now an association. Within the Medmenham Club, and now association, there are quite a lot of people who had taken items of mementos of their service, documents and some bits of equipment, and as their relatives wanted to clear out after they sadly died, or as they were moving house, they would find a repository for their collections within the club association, and so there were people within the club who thought, right, we must do something properly with these, and a collection was sort of formed out of the club and association, and became a separate charity in 2000, and as well as stuff from members, some enlightened people who were members of the club as well, who were still serving, particularly instructors at the Joint School of Photographic Interpretation, it was then called. They started a history room and managed to save a lot of stuff at various units from being disposed. And from that history room and things, we started the archive when we built up with all the stuff there. But it is worth pointing out that as well as some of the more formal stuff going to National Archives, that all the imagery that was kept at Medmenham and successor organisations, that officially has to go to a place called National Collection of Air Photography up in Edinburgh, or if it's of UK, to Historic England based in Swindon. They keep the official archives of the remaining stuff. Quite a lot was, for various reasons, disposed of, but actual imagery is with them.
So I understand the collection has material that's prior to the Second World War.
Oh, very much so. One of our heroes is a gentleman called Hugh Hamshaw Thomas, seen here in the First World War, out in Palestine, where he was the photographic officer for the Royal Flying Corps and then the RAF, using a stereoscope. and his family have gifted us a huge amount of material that he kept. A very well organised person, actually a paleobotanist, and a very famous Cambridge Don in that field. And gems like the notes on aerial photography in Mesopotamia.
Oh, wow.
Produced in Baghdad in 1918.
So over 100 years old.
Over 100 years old, yes. Actually, showing a bit of bookworm here. And within this book, there's examples of the sort of photography they were looking at and the items they would be seeing, the features they'd be seeing in the aerial photography they was taking. In the context of Palestine and Hamshaw Thomas's involvement, Lawrence of Arabia actually makes comments about the value of the mapping that was available for him, and that was derived from extensive program of aerial reconnaissance.
Right. Yeah.
Another example of First World War stuff. Were you aware that there was an RAF Stonehenge?
No, I wasn't actually.
Yeah, this is one of the albums we've been gifted. Somebody who was involved just at the end of the First World War, RAF Stonehenge with the photographic sections hut.
So were there any innovations at Medmenham?
Yes, they were. The bunch of people that were working there, they had a lot of very, very bright people. How similar they were in brightness to the famous people at Bletchley Park, I'm not quite sure, but they definitely had some top-class minds there. Examples of the innovations, part of the bombing campaign, they wanted to make sure they were hitting the most important targets.
Yeah.
And the section that was involved with looking at decoy sites and some elements of camouflage and things, they were set the task of looking at all the industrial areas, and actually they set a system of scoring the industrial areas for the number of anti-aircraft artillery, the number of barrage balloons, the extent to which they were camouflaged. You can set up decoy sites, and from that scoring system they realised that the Germans were putting their main effort into an area that had the ball bearing factories in it. So the innovation on the way they approached the subject with the Medmenham focused in on some of the most important bombing attacks that were done during the Second World War. Those clever minds at Medmenham, they also were great at having sort of technical innovations. They developed something they referred to as a damometer to plot an area where the bombing was occurred, so they could quickly work out by mechanical means the extent of the bombing and the effect of the bombing, and that was very important to
yes, it was,
assessing
wasn't it?
the bombing.
So what other innovative stuff went on at RAF Medmenham?
One of the ones I like is the machine they called the altimeter. The section that were looking at radars and other wireless antenna type features, they were going through lots of complicated tables to measure the heights after looking at the shadow lengths. And one of the technically minded people within that section devised a machine they referred to as an altimeter, shown here, where they could just set the dials, rather like a slide rule, to the different conditions and immediately read off the right figure.
Tim, would you say there are lessons to be learned from Medmenham?
I think when firstly, the people doing the courses, they are aware of the history here, and they come through the museum when they're doing the modern imagery analyst courses. And the person who instructs the fundamentals elements, he's picked some items out of 1940s manuals to include as examples. But what I hope they get, and I know that talking to the analysts they do get, is a couple of lessons directly from Medmenham, I think, is that the importance of background intelligence, being given the full picture of what's happening, so that they can add the values from the imagery analysis from the imagery that they've got available to them.
This is not RAF intelligence in isolation, is it? So this is going to be feeding into, whether it's the Second World War or contemporary times, the value of this is across the services, isn't it?
Yes, they're very much now. The idea is fusion, where all the different disciplines very much working together. In the Second World War, though, the analysts were often starved of the background information, so it took them longer than necessary to get to the right answer. But now they're part of a community of different intelligence disciplines, and immediately have that collateral information to hand. And a lot of the modern analysts will actually go through various disciplines as imagery and some of the other intelligence disciplines.
It was great, sharing this with me, and I just wondering, is there any tie-in here with SOE, with the Special Operations Executive?
Yes, there was a section within Medmenham that was one of the more secret sections within the unit, putting out stuff at most secret level, that was involved with picking the sites for the SOE aircraft landing and the parachute dropping. And one of the great lessons to be learnt from that one was that initially the section's results, the section's products weren't particularly good, because the people in the Air Ministry were just saying, can you give us some information about a field somewhere near this town? And only when they got the trust of the interpreters and the people in the Air Ministry, when they actually said, look, actually this is because we want to land an aircraft there at night, and these are the sort of hazards we're looking out for, then they started producing really useful information from Medmenham, and they realised that the best interpreters to produce that information on those landing grounds were ones who came from farming families, because they understood the process of the, how the ground would be and at what stage you might be doing the ploughing, which obviously isn't very conducive to landing a Lysander on the field. So that was an example where it was important for the interpreters to get the full information about the question they were being asked, not just being asked a straightforward yes/no question.
It's my understanding that RAF Medmenham obviously had preparations ahead of D-Day. Can you explain a bit more? Because they were crucial, weren't they, these plans for D-Day?
Yes, a huge amount of effort from Medmenham was devoted to the preparations for D-Day, and a lot of the expertise that they developed ahead of 1944 was relevant. Some of the interpreters were actually moved to the D-Day planning headquarters away from Medmenham for security purposes, but the expertise that they'd learnt at Medmenham was applicable, and they took it with them. And Medmenham was producing collecting, housing and processing the imagery that was relevant to the D-Day planning. And they'd learnt, and they started doing this very early on, almost straight after Dunkirk. They started doing the planning operation, and the interpreters were involved with that. And they then learnt lessons from Operation Torch, the landings in. And so there's a lot of expertise was able to be brought to bear for D-Day. And the quantity of imagery reports and the knowledge that people had of the area in Normandy was such that answers were given very quickly to any of the questions. The quality of the mapping for D-Day is relevant as well. A lot of the mapping that was used for them was included a lot of intelligence information derived from the interpreters, as well as the geographical information. And the other thing that the Medmenham was producing was models of the area.
Yes, of course, very important.
And the troops that went out to D-Day, each section had access and physically have models of the areas that they were going to be landing at. Very few of those models exist anymore, but one of the key things about those models is that they were producing more than one copy of each model, because Medmenham had developed a process of actually making them out of an early form of PVC. So there were actually rubber models that they could literally roll up and carry under their arm and take on the landing craft. The other significant thing about the D-Day time was that the V weapons were being deployed in Normandy at the same time. So there's an huge amount of imagery was being collected in that area, useful both for the Normandy operations, D-Day landings, and the hunt for the V weapons. As I said, the contribution before D-Day was significant, but by all accounts after D-Day, as the troops moved eastwards, the army took over a lot of the photographic interpretation effort there and went with the troops, but that was quite a difficult challenge there to keep up with the forward movement and keep the collection. So there's an area that will warrant further investigation, is quite how useful it was post D-Day, but before D-Day it was incredibly important. One of the figures that's been quoted for the whole of the Second World War is that 80% of the intelligence was derived from imagery. Quite how accurate that assessment is, I don't know, but the effort at Medmenham, as I say, going up to 2,000 people or so, was absolutely vast by the time of D-Day of 1944.
Yeah, because it reminds me of some of my own research actually on for the book that I did, The Walls Have Ears, and for that, of course, it's crucial where I looked at the bug conversations of German prisoners of war, and in particular Hitler's captured generals at Trent Park in North London. And of course RAF Medmenham was absolutely crucial, their aerial photography in piecing together intelligence and corroborating other intelligence, which led to the bombing of Peenemünde, that much I told. So it's interesting that I've got a personal link into the collection there. That's really helpful, thank you.
And I can show you the when they were producing the models, the pictures in this lovely album of the process. Here you can see the rubber being pulled off the mould. And then here this is Kiel rather than a D-Day site. They're inspecting the details on it.
I mean, it seems to me there's such a multifaceted layer of the legacy of RAF Medmenham. But can I ask you finally, do you have a particular favourite item or artefact, papers within the collection?
I think I've already mentioned Hugh Hamshaw Thomas, who was the photographic officer for Palestine and pioneered a lot of doing the photographic interpretation properly. When he left Medmenham, before the end of the war, he left on health grounds. He was actually one of the oldest people in RAF uniform. When he left, they passed around a autograph album, I think they were best described, for people to fill in, and it became a real work of art with some in the section, one of the more graphically talented people there producing a coat of arms for him.
Oh, that's incredible.
Looks
isn't
proper,
it?
but actually is mock, but all very well explained. And the various sections, sometimes just basic signatures, but then the more talented sections. Here, this section.
Oh, yes. I like that.
Yeah. The Fixing the World. But the notable signature here is Sarah Oliver. That was the married name of Sarah Churchill, the Prime Minister's daughter. Dorothy Garrod is in here. She was a very memorable character. Was the first professor in Oxford or Cambridge to run a department. She was one of the many Cambridge archaeologists who was working at Medmenham. And this one of the decoy section, hence the picture of the duck decoy set up. Phipps was the Daily Mail's main cartoonists, and this gives a little insight into the various sections of Medmenham.
I can really see why that's your favourite piece in the whole collection. Incredible. Tim, thank you so much for sharing the secrets of RAF Medmenham. Thank you.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.